Hello and namaste to all our viewers. This is Aditi Sharma, Chief Research Officer of IGlobal, and I warmly welcome you to the first panel of the second day of GLACON 2022. In this panel, we're discussing a very important topic in the area of international environmental law, that is India's role in transforming environmental security and regulation in the Indo-Pacific. So with me today, I have four very special people who will help you understand the nuances of this topic. With us, we have, first of all, Ms. Aditi Jha, who is Environment and International Development Specialist. She has developed and managed some of South Asia's biodiversity and landscape conservation projects. Ms. Jha is currently an environmental specialist at Brand Group and leading a forest and natural capital engagement strategy. She's also an international ESG advisor at UNDP and co-founder of Global Green Recovery Collaboration. Then, with us we have Dr. Dhanashri Jairam, who is assistant professor at Manipal Academy of Higher Education, and she works in the Department of Geopolitics and International Relationships. Her area of research is environment security research, environmental migration, environmental peace building, transboundary resources, governance in South Asia, geopolitics of Indian Ocean region, and water relations. My apologies for the network connections. I hope I'm fully audible now. So, cutting the introduction of our panelist, the next panelist is Ms. Nandini Hariharan, who is a research analyst with the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, in which her primary area of research is governance of global commons. She works on climate risks and adaptation, natural disaster, food, land use and desertification, governance of the marine environment, climate friendly technologies. Finally, we have our very own Mr. Abhivdan, who needs no formal introduction. But again, for those who do not know him, he is the president of the GLACON 2022, president and managing trustee of Global Law Assembly, chairperson of Indian Society of AI and Law. I extend a very warm welcome to you all and thank you all for accepting our invitation to join this panel. So now let's begin with discussion of our panel, and to start with, let me very briefly introduce the topic that we'll be discussing today to you all. So, as you all know that India's role in Indo-Pacific is considered crucial by many countries, and India has been championing free and open Indo-Pacific area, initiating forums like security and growth for all in the region and Indo-Pacific Ocean initiatives. It even has engaged in its Indo-Pacific partners either bilaterally or on multilateral platforms in a magnitude of spheres. In spheres like maritime security, blue economy, maritime connectivity. But India continually lacked a coherent Indo-Pacific strategy. However, many issues like emergence of China in its area of strategic influence on Indo-Pacific, concerns for United States' long-term commitment to Asia, as well as limitation of existing multilateral institutions, all of these issues compelled India to review foreign policy, and therefore Indo-Pacific is now a new domain in India's strategic foreign policy engagement. It represented a shift in India's strategic environment and expanded its threats, sold its continental borders to its maritime space. Therefore, for the discussion in this panel, I'll be focusing on India's role in transforming security and regulation in the region specific. So, to begin discussion, my first question would be to Ms. Jha. Question would be, ma'am, what according to you is India's role, essential purpose as an environmental actor in the Indo-Pacific? If you could give us kind of a maritime perspective in relation to climate and biodiversity specifically, how do you see Indo-Pacific economy in general?
Thanks, Aditi. This question is to me, right? Just confirming because it kind of broke up when you were saying, but I think I heard Jha.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes, yes,
uh,
ma'am. This question is true.
great. All right. So, yeah, thank you so much, Aditi, and thanks to Abhivardhan and to this Glacon platform for inviting me to speak on this panel. I think this is a super relevant and a really kind of forward-looking discussion. And I think Aditi, you outlined, some of the kind of this is a arena in policy that is still developing. I think not only does India have increasing strategic interest in this Indo-Pacific region, but I think there's also increasing expectations from India as a leader in the region, especially given the Quad alliance. Look, countries like Australia, Japan, and the US seeing India as a leading actor and a counterweight to China. I think the first point of note, and you mentioned the term maritime, is the Indo-Pacific covers countries of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and given this kind of geographic and the biophysical elements of this region, I think environmental and climate security is entirely central to all of the countries in the Indo-Pacific, to their growth, to their development, and to their security. And this is both in terms of traditional security, in terms of the kind of potential for conflict from climate risk and degradation, looking at how you kind of preserve your territorial integrity, all of those questions, but also in terms of non-traditional or human security, in terms of the impacts that this can pose to human lives. I think a good framework would be to look at the kind of two global environmental risks, based on which there are also two UN conventions, and the role that India can play within these in the Indo-Pacific. So the two risks I refer to are climate change and biodiversity. I think a third one is desertification, but I think in a maritime context, desertification becomes less significant as compared to climate change and biodiversity. In terms of climate change and the UNFCCC, I think it's specific. It's especially relevant to this region because Indo-Pacific is the most populous region on the planet. It also has the highest number of vulnerable island states, as well as countries currently, and historically subject to the most amount of kind of extreme climatic events. So these include countries like Myanmar, Philippines, Thailand. India itself, has been increasingly facing extreme weather events. There's also a statistic I've kind of noted, which is 57 million people, according to the Red Cross, have been affected by climate disasters in this Indo-Pacific region. So, in terms of climate leadership, I think the first role that India plays is its commitment to participation. I think that's really obvious that India should participate, but I think given, for example, US, wanting to leave the Paris Agreement, I think even participation needs to be stated. I think on another aspect, India needs to provide leadership both in terms of mitigation and adaptation to climate change. So, for example, in terms of mitigation, India, of course, it needs to lead by example. So, one positive step is that we do have a net zero target now. And we're also looking at leading increasingly on renewable energy. So we have the International Solar Alliance, where we've shown leadership, and we're also taking steps to lead on green hydrogen. I think another key and critical element is though on adaptation. And so adaptation, I think, would cover things like early warning. India's taken one step in having a really good tsunami early warning system. And I think it needs to use that to increase its kind of information sharing and exchange on, early warning cooperation. I think another area is disaster relief and support. And I think one, very encouraging area and promising area that we saw emerging right now was during COVID and the leadership that India took. And while there were, of course, hiccups, I think India proved that it can step up and, take a leadership even from a kind of disaster support and mitigation element. And then I think, obviously, another obvious one is that India needs to take a risk based approach to its own security and continue to be a kind of stable country to be able to continue to provide this kind of leadership role. The other convention that I mentioned and threat is biodiversity, and this is an often ignored one. But I think the Indo-Pacific, apart from being the most populous, the most vulnerable to climate change, is also the most biodiverse region on the planet. It is it has the most number of biodiversity hotspots, and it's contested, but I think even if it's not COVID, but several zoonotic diseases have been linked to biodiversity loss and habitat fragmentation. India's conventionally always actually been a leader in the area of biodiversity conservation. They are one of the few developed kind of bigger countries that have signed the Nagoya Protocol, which is related to accessing genetic resources linked to biodiversity and getting people, the benefits from that. So, and India is also one of the only countries that has an act completely dedicated to biodiversity. So in this space, definitely India, has provided leadership, but it needs to do more. It needs to do more in terms of leading by example, in terms of also, where it invests and how it looks at, given the number of island states in the region, India can start by also leading by example. I know there are, currently, a lot of criticism around how India is developing its own islands, like, for example, the Andaman's development. So I think in that, India needs to lead more by example. I think yeah, and then there's the coastal security, the area of blue economy that you mentioned. We have the Sundarbans that we share with Bangladesh, which is, the largest mangrove ecosystem on the planet. So looking at some of these aspects are where I think in the Indo-Pacific, India, plays a really critical role, and also has the kind of strength to take a leadership role. I'll stop there. Thanks. Sorry, I spoke a bit long, but.
Thank you. If the other two panelists have anything to add to it, they can.
Can I? And yeah. I think Aditi just laid out the foundation so well with all the major contributions from India so far as international legal provisions are concerned, also domestic policies which are in tune with the legal provisions that have been introduced at the international level. Just to add on to what she said about Quad in particular, and also a few other issues, I think Quad is very peculiar in that way because India is the only like developing country in Quad, and that makes a lot of difference. And this is where I think India needs to kind of step up and put forth what are the requirements of the developing countries, because in the larger discussions in UNFCCC and other international forums, climate justice and equity are still not been operationalized enough. There are a lot of discussions that happen, but there is still requirement for mobilization of climate finance at a much faster pace and much higher level. So these are some issues where I think India needs to play the leadership, considering Indo-Pacific is such a diverse region with most vulnerable countries, developing countries with different developmental requirements, because not all are at similar stages of development either. And so this is very important that India needs to highlight these issues as part of the working group on climate change, which has been formed under Quad. And this needs to also get streamlined into how global climate governance works. Because today, global climate governance is not just about UNFCCC, it's about different forums. It's about bilateral forums, it's about multilateral fora, which have been working on this, which are all tied to the Paris Agreement as well. So, achieving the goals of Paris Agreement is not just about the UNFCCC. There are various other forums which are working towards these goals. Secondly, I think it's important to also reflect on India's leadership in transboundary related issues. That's very important. And I think this is where India has been lagging a little behind as far as river water sharing issues is concerned, for instance. With most of our neighbors, we still haven't really figured out our river water sharing relations. We have treaties in place, but these treaties are not foolproof as such. There are still issues regarding how these treaties would withstand the pressure that climate change is posing, or say how groundwater extraction is going to change, say, the water availability in both India and Pakistan. How is that going to affect Indus Waters Treaty? Because we are talking about surface waters mostly. So I think transboundary water-related issues and transboundary eco-regional issues. It's not something that is just about water, but even otherwise, like in the Hindu Kush Himalaya region or Indian Ocean region, you look at issues that are there. There are so many which require holistic, more comprehensive, more transboundary related, solutions, joint kind of solutions, basin-wide management of resources. So these are the things where India needs to kind of show leadership from now on if it wants to be seen as a more legitimate leader in terms of its regional leadership in its neighborhood, as well as in the broader Indo-Pacific region. But in some areas, like Aditi mentioned, in disaster management, I think already India has shown leadership in the past, especially after the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. That was like the time when India showed where and in what in what capacities it can help the neighboring countries. But beyond that, we are talking about a much bigger region now, and you have Pacific islands which have their own vulnerabilities. We saw what happened with the volcanic eruption that happened recently, how much it affected the island countries. So what can India do in such circumstances? So for that, for India to have that sort of influence in the extended neighborhood, I think we need to show our also leadership in terms of these issues which are transboundary in nature in our own neighborhood. Yeah.
I just like to come in on this. And honestly, I think my two panelists have given a lot of points on this. I just wanted to connect a few of the points across both panelists over here. One was pick up on Aditi's points on how India needs to play a more active role in this region, which I do think that India has been playing a lot of active role, and which is where its leadership now is actually showing. Especially being an active role with IORA, with the East Asia Summit, on the environmental side. But then on the defense side, where we talk about integrating climate security with national priorities of security, which is what is extremely critical at this moment. Because we first, like Aditya said, need to first transition from what traditional idea of security means, which at the moment is all about looking at what national security is, looking at army, looking at armed forces. But we need to start to integrate climate security into this, which again has happened with the ASEAN Defense Ministry meeting, which has also happened with the ASEAN Regional Forum. Now, the second area where I think that India is doing some amount of work, at least their Navy is doing some amount of work, is with the recent assessment of cyclones in the Bay of Bengal region, where they have tried to look into how can they climate-proof their ports and their naval bases against once-in-a-century flood cyclonic events, which I think is a very cognizant way of bringing in this aspect of national security and climate security into this forum. The second area where I do think that at least an initiative where India could maybe collaborate a bit more on is something like the Australia-US UK alliance, which is more of a military pact, not pact, but alliance as compared to the Quad, wherein wherein they can bring in this whole aspect of human security and climate security and state security under this whole prism of climate change. And the second point that I wanted to highlight was, again, on Aditi's point on the risk approach and building this early warning system. I think before we can even get the technology, apart from bringing in the technology and finance, is to understand at a very granular level that what are the climate risks different countries are facing. And for this, it's very important that we start to develop, every country needs to bring in this expertise to develop this granular 25 by 25 kilometer scale climate risk atlas, wherein you understand. So I know where I'm sitting in Gurgaon, and Rohini is probably about 30 kilometers away from me, but we probably have two very different climates. There are not climates, but weathers. There are times where it's pouring over there and it's not happening over here. So it's very important that we understand that kind of granular level of climate risk. And then I know CW is currently actually developing India's first climate risk atlas. And how do we now expand that to other South Asian countries? Southeast Asian countries to understand on a coastal scale also what exactly is happening, what is the kind of infrastructure port development that is required. So these were a couple of areas I want to like quickly jump into.
Thank you, ma'am. So then now let's move to the second. And my next question would be to Dhanashri, ma'am. Ma'am, my question would be first, like you briefed all of us about maritime and climate security with respect to India Pacific. But now I would like you to kind of focus more on, according to you, are practical challenges in India's environmental law regulatory mechanism. And when I say regulatory mechanism, legal regulatory mechanism, I'm not just saying focusing only on Indo-Pacific, but even in general.
Yeah, thank you, Aditi. Like, I'm not a legal specialist, so I can't go into the the specifics of the regulatory mechanisms. But just to answer the transboundary related issues and how do you deal with environmental regulations, environmental issues through regulations which need to be like transboundary. Uh, that's, I think, very important in today's era. And some of the issues, I think, where we will have a lot of challenges in the future. One is climate migration. There is no clear understanding of climate migration in the region as of now. We don't have an international law as well which recognizes climate migrant or climate refugee or environmental migrant. We don't have any such law as of now. UN is discussing. There's been a lot of momentum that has been built on it as well, but still we are kind of far off from defining it and mainstreaming it, as a legal provision as of now. So this is going to be a major challenge, and there are a lot of countries, including India, which are not even part of the refugee law as of now, right? So in that sense, how are countries going to standardize their laws regarding migration, which may be caused or triggered or indirectly, directly, in whichever ways, because it's very difficult to say why people migrate or how people migrate, which are linked to climate change, right? So this is going to be a major challenge from a regulatory perspective, especially when it's transboundary, right? So yeah, there's already a lot of intrastate migration that is happening. It's you see that in India, where rural to urban migration, coastal areas to interior areas. You see in Bangladesh that is happening. That has been happening for some time, which is why Dhaka has become one of the most populous cities, densely populated cities in the world. So this has been happening for some time. But what happens when which is also happening, by the way, there is seasonal migration happening because of subsistence farmers, for instance, migrating from Nepal to India for temporary jobs and going back to their countries. So this is happening, but how do you really account for it? How do you have regulatory mechanisms that can deal with this challenge, right? So this is, and the challenge here is not migration, because migration itself is like a way of adaptation for people, right? So they're trying to move into safer areas for employment or whatever. But the challenge here is more like, how do you have laws to regulate this or manage this? So this is one of the major areas which I think will require further deliberations, not just in Indo-Pacific. This is something, a global issue. I don't think this is an Indo-Pacific problem as such. The second problem which I have found is that although countries have well-developed disaster management laws within their countries, when it comes to transboundary disaster management, there is still gap in terms of understanding each other's standard operating procedures. What is the terms of reference? How do the militaries work with each other? There is still, these are things that can be built through exercises. Some countries, because they have been engaging in military exercises and everything, they understand each other much better. But Indo-Pacific is a much broader area. You require a lot more understanding. And of course, the US is probably the most active in that sense in this region in HADR related activities. So maybe there is something to be done from India's part also. And also, I think US also needs to work towards finding that standardized ways of dealing with disasters, because we saw problems in Philippines after Typhoon Haiyan. We saw problems in Nepal after the earthquake, when in Indian, Chinese, and various other aid agencies got involved. but there was major chaos as to how the disaster relief and missions were working. There was not much understanding on how it has to be done. The other legal or regulatory aspect which is coming up now, it's going to be a challenge as well as actually environmental due diligence in supply chains, right? So this is going to be a major challenge for developing countries which are not used to having stricter laws about mainstreaming environmental regulations into supply chains and trade and all of that. EU is already thinking of implementing it. The UN is also in discussions about having a uniformly agreed upon kind of mechanism which is more like international in nature. So now the issue is, okay, climate needs to be part of trade, climate needs to be part of all domains, right? So climatization, as we call it, of different domains. So due diligence, how do you make sure that environmental due diligence happens at the domestic level so that India's own trade, for instance, does not get affected, or other developing countries, their developmental requirements do not get affected? And this is very important, and this is where the developed countries in particular need to step up before they start implementing these laws at their domestic level without understanding the requirements of the developing countries, which are not used to having such strict laws already. So I think these are some of the issues where we will have some challenges. The other challenge, which I think, which is like a broader international challenge as well, is, we are talking about coordination between Paris Agreement, Sustainable Development Goals, Sendai Framework on Disaster Risk Reduction, because all of these have a lot of overlaps in that sense. But coordination is something that hasn't happened. All of them recognize that climate change is something that Paris Agreement needs to deal with. Disasters is something that Sendai Framework should deal with. Sustainable Development Goals, which is like 17 very, very broad goals, which includes pretty much everything. So I think, this is again where regulatory mechanisms are not they're not in place to have these issues dealt with in a very coordinated manner. So I think these are some of the challenges which I can say as of now. But like I mentioned, I'm not a legal specialist, so I'm sure others would have more to add here.
I think I would like to ask the same question to Abhivardhan. He would also be the right person to answer this question.
Thank you so much for the intervention to be sought. So, as I said, I'm not a panelist, I'm an intervener. So, I'll intervene in short and I'll say that as far as environmental regulation is concerned, I definitely agree with utmost humility that the international community has not come up with a treaty on climate migration as of now. In fact, uh, we know the situation in island states near New Zealand, which is the Oceania region, that is Tuvalu, Kiribati, and so forth. We see the situation in Bangladesh. We see the situation in Maldives, and we understand that there are sinking states, and they also are sovereign states after all, and under not just environment protection but also from a perspective of international law, they require that asserted safeguarding and recognition. Now, climate refugees can come from there, and that somewhere down the line can be problematic even for countries which are peninsulas, or they are actually near the sea. For landlocked countries, that's a different question altogether. That might not be a matter for them. Even the United States also suffers from this problem, wherein if we take the state of Florida, for example. So I guess yes, there should be some political consensus and then a legal and policy consensus. I guess the International Law Commission might have started working on it. There is some seminal recognition on this issue. However, we are still yet to see a proper United Nations convention to come on it. Maybe if a convention does not come, then at least for now, I think since the Indo-Pacific is considered as the pivot of resilience of supply chains and maritime security, because I think what Indo-Pacific has become these days is exactly what the transatlantic partnership, the concept of NATO and all of that used to be during the beginning of the Cold War. So the hype towards a geopolitical construct shapes the whole scenario of regulation. We all know that happened during the Cold War for the transatlantic region, the Atlantic Ocean region between United States and Britain. The Atlantic Charter came in, and of course NATO was there. With the Indo-Pacific, we now see that there's a shift from the very much of a commercial concept of Asia Pacific to the Indo Pacific. And I think there, the challenge that comes for India is that while these regulations need to be defined, they are not just about India's domestic challenges, but also about upholding proper cooperation on environment issues, which might be transboundary, which might be of maritime nature. Uh, so I think there is something which has to be done. It has to be begun with. I guess the UNHCR, which is the High Commissioner for Refugees, already have sought some uh, guidelines and approaches on human rights and climate migration. So there is some work which is beginning. And if we look at why India has not ratified the 1951 convention and its protocol, it's simply because the 1946 Foreigners Act does not work like that. And uh, India has a deep administrative problem that it has not the number of people required, which again causes policy paralysis in its overall refugee, and I would say not just refugee, even immigration management. So the Ministry of External Affairs does have this issue, the Ministry of Home Affairs does have this issue. But yes, they need to have a consistent refugee policy. And then, of course, eventually a particular act which replaces the Foreigners Act and a bit proper act comes in. But of course, legislative plus some pseudo regulatory recourse is needed. Once then that develops out, I think a proper mature discourse can emerge in at the level of policymakers. So that's my view in short, and I think I would be happy to contribute as the discussion moves forward.
Thank you so much, Abhivardhan. So moving ahead, my next question would be to Ms. Jha as well as Ms. Nandini. So my question would be, when we talk about the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, I would like to know your view on the dynamics behind reflecting the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities specific to the Indo-Pacific region. So Ms. Jha, you can answer first, followed by Ms. Nandini.
Thanks, Aditi. I think so. I actually wanted to mention one point that connects to what we were just discussing previously, which was some of the kind of practical challenges in in the legal and regulatory mechanisms. And while I'm not taking a legal perspective, I'm coming with a practitioner's perspective of the importance of considering trade-offs. And I think that connects with the previous question as well as this current question, which is, I think the biggest challenge is obviously the trade-off between environment and development. And I think it's really obvious that there isn't a kind of really a win-win or a silver bullet, because I think even when we look at something like renewable energy, and this is a space that I work in, and I actually work on the kind of environmental and social safeguards of implementing renewable energy. You see that some of these have massive implications on the kind of land that is being planned for installing renewable energy. In a lot of cases, they're looking at floating solar projects, because land is a kind of scarce commodity, and that's actually impacting our ecological coastal ecosystems. So I think that's definitely the big challenge. And the other challenge is obviously what was also mentioned is the kind of security approach that sometimes leads to less cooperation, and also working in silos. Coming to the common but differentiated responsibility, I think Dhanashree made a really good point at the beginning, which is that India, as a kind of developing nation that has these kind of extremes of leadership on the one hand, of really large private sector interests being able to kind of shift the needle on spaces like renewable energy and stuff, but at the same time a massive poverty, community dependence on ecosystems, on forestry. India, I think, plays a really important role in kind of threading that space of representing developing nations' interests, but also having to step up and take ownership, because the again, the trade-off of not acting and only looking at your development interests in the long run is going to be extremely detrimental, extremely risky, from a climate and degradation perspective. So I think, on this, my take would be, I like that the question mentions dynamics, because it is truly a space where there's so many kind of dynamics of how India, the kind of role that India plays, both in terms of representing developing nations interests, but also having to kind of step up and take leadership and act. I think there are civil society forums that find that currently India's NDCs are not adequate, to achieving the kind of 1.52-degree change that we're looking at. But nor are many countries. I mean, there are no country whose actions in the present moment are enough. But I think, yeah, to conclude, both of these sides needs to kind of be taken into consideration. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Thank you, ma'am. Abhilan, if you would like to add to something with respect to the same issue.
I'd recommend that let the rest of the panelists share their views, and then I would be happy to intervene.
I don't actually have an expertise on this particular area, but I think it's also quite important to understand what has actually happened when it comes to emissions by developed nations in the past, and how the fact that your big protocols like the Kyoto Protocol, the Doha Amendment, none of those have actually been followed or achieved by your developing nations so far. So I think it's quite important to have this particular amendment in place in the Paris Agreement, simply because I think it's also very critical to have or provide the chance for developing countries to develop, and not actually like enforce them to have this sort of grounding their development due to green strategies, unless you can have developed countries promising actually successfully promising and delivering on things like climate finance, which hasn't come through yet, and which is just being delayed year on year on year, and two, actually promising on technology collaborations as well, which again is not a very global initiative at all. I think there is still a lot of discrepancy when it comes to where research and development is taking place and where your resources are actually found. So CW actually did this analysis to see that there are about 32 not global partnerships, but green hydrogen initiatives, of which 24 are bilateral, of which 10 are in the Asian nation, and only 2 are actually being done on research and development in developing countries, wherein your majority of renewable energy sources are actually in your global south and your tropical nations, but there is no technology development. Your growth in energy, in electricity, in emissions is all taking place in this region. Yet, if you do not have technology being transferred here, if you do not have finance being coming in over here, you cannot expect nations to be growing. There's also numbers that showcase that the amount of emissions that Annex 1 countries in general have done since 1995, and the amount that they were supposed to reduce is almost 9 times of what India, no, not 9 times, is almost equivalent to 9 years of India's emissions. Now, how do you tell developing countries that you need to now stop that? You need to now transition to a technology that doesn't even exist and finance that we don't see. So I think it's very important to consider that countries need to develop, but finance needs to come in. I'm not saying that countries should just focus on fossil fuel growth, but if you're forcing a country, or if you're demanding for countries to be green, you need to deliver on finance and technology. And until that doesn't happen, I don't think we can move forward globally.
Yeah, those are, I think, very important points. And I just want to, I think, if you just look at what happened at Glasgow recently, it kind of showed that CBDR as a principle is continuously being diluted by the developed countries, or there is constant that urge to dilute it as much as you can. So even when India declared the net zero target of 2070, so yes, there was one part of the crowd that cheered India, while the others said it's too late. But then, what about the developed countries? They are declaring 2050 as their target for achieving the net zero. Is that fair? So where did the fairness go? Right. So CBDR needs to take these issues into consideration. So already historical responsibility is something that it's almost like it's like thrown out of the window. Nobody's discussing it. Nobody wants to put it in a legal form in any of the agreements any longer, right? So it's only in principle that you agree that yes, there is historical responsibility. But what happened to these issues, which were actually at one point of time, these were uncompromisable principles, like historical responsibility is one of them. At least differentiation is still there, but differentiation also, I see that constantly there is an erosion that is happening. So there's like constant demand from the developing countries to act more. So which is why when towards the end of the summit, when India it seemed that India was the only one that demanded it, but actually a lot of countries, the whole of G20 countries, had agreed that the phrase of coal phase out should be replaced with coal phase down. This was something that most of the countries had agreed upon, but it just looked like India came out as a villain, which was unfortunate. But so this is where I think there CBDR needs to be operationalized in a much better way. We haven't been able to do that. Even with Kyoto Protocol, yes, there was a clear understanding that developing countries don't need to reduce their emissions in a legally binding manner, although voluntary emissions reductions can be adopted. But you look at the second commitment of the Kyoto Protocol, when did it come? It is like after the Paris Agreement was supposed to come into effect. So it's just a joke. I have not understood what is the point of this coming into effect after 2020. If Paris Agreement is already supposed to come into force by then. I mean, it's already come into force, but it's supposed to, all the countries are supposed to achieve the NDCs now. So I have not understood the logic of it, which is something that I struggle with UNFCCC quite a lot, that what does it mean? When the time was over, it was supposed to be achieved between 2012 and 2020, during which time it was not operationalized by the UNFCCC. So this is where there are a lot of broken promises, which we call very commonly we refer to the broken promises in global climate governance, which need to be fulfilled for CBDR and fairness and all these principles to be recognized. It's not just like Nandini and Aditi mentioned, this climate finance, technology. Look at the geopolitics of extraction itself, right? So you have extractive activities happening in the most conflict-ridden countries like Congo and others, adding more fuel to the conflicts, and all of this kind of is used by developed countries, of course China as well, which is dominating the mineral value chains today. And you're talking about EVs and renewable energy. So where are the minerals coming from? And these communities where you are extracting these rare earths, they are hardly getting the benefits of this industry. This is where again fairness is completely just doesn't exist in a big way. So I think the reality, and since Aditi is also working on the downsides of renewable energy industry, it's very important to look at that as well when we look at fairness and when we look at CBDR. And how does it affect security? How does it affect the local communities? So, CBDR is something that needs to be implemented at the international level, where developed countries definitely need to step up if they are serious about, achieving the Paris goals, because I don't think it's the onus is on the developing countries to do more, and then only the developed countries will do as much as they had agreed upon. I don't think the logic works like that. And at the domestic level as well, because I think it's already happening in India. For instance, I see Jharkhand, the government of Jharkhand. Jharkhand is, of course, one of these coal-rich states which cannot give up on its revenues on coal, and it has a large workforce that depends on the coal industry. So you can't suddenly just shut down saying, oh, coal is bad for our country and it's bad for our climate goals. So I see that government of Jharkhand is already seeking help for just transition strategies. How do we put in place? So that we have put in place certain measures, and we are taking small steps. We are at the beginning of it. I think that means that the intent, the seriousness is there. It's just that we need like an international environment where everybody takes upon their shoulders the responsibility that is theirs, without like expecting others to do their bit first.
Um, Aditi, do you want to say anything? I had one other intervention that I just wanted to bring it in here. On the aspect of energy justice and an equitable transition and fairness that Dr. Jairam actually really well put it forward really well. We also need to understand how long advanced economies have actually taken to put out their net zero targets. For example, the EU sort of peaked. India hasn't even cold peaked yet. But the EU peaked maybe like what I think in the early 90s. US peaked, cold peaked in the 2000s. China has not cold peaked yet. EU has taken 70 years to put out their net zero target. The US has taken almost 50 years. India has not cold peaked yet and has still put out their net zero target. We also need to take into consideration that the cumulative emissions of India, if we include its net zero targets, is around 80 gigawatts. For the same period, for China and the US, including the net zero targets, is almost around 340, 350 gigawatts and 100 gigawatts for the same period. So we also need to understand that even India, if it continues its current growth, if it continues its current emission, we still are not emitting as much as countries have already emitted, and with their reduced emissions also, how much they will emit. Secondly, you also need to look into the global per capita emission, which is something that people don't take into account. They take into account how much is a country emitting, but not how much a country's per capita emissions. And India's per capita emissions is actually one third of the global average compared to the US, which is almost 7 times that of India. 3 times that. China is almost 3 times that of India, and the EU as well is almost 3 times that of India. So until we take these numbers into consideration, we cannot achieve like a global energy equitable transition.
So my next question would be to Shri ma'am. My question would be with respect to climate security. What would be do you think that these climate security conditions they shape some of the other India's behavior since in West Asia?
Okay, so I think the question, if it's audible from my side, I think the question was actually to Dr. Jairam, and of course, uh, Miss Harihar, and of course, Aditi can actually add up if they wish to. It's completely up to them. So I think the question was this, because this is the concluding question about India's international projects. So we know that we are investing not just in our country but also outside. We have tried to do it in West Asia. We have tried to do it in Africa. We have already done in Mauritius and Maldives and Bhutan. So if we look at India's development initiatives, and this is a bit of an economic perspective which I'm asking for, but um, I am pretty sure that there are certain environment related projects which India has undergone through in various countries. So, how do you see the purpose and the essential role of such initiatives which um, the Ministry of External Affairs has taken through its embassies and, of course, other ventures? So, um, your views, ma'am. What do you think?
Yeah. Okay. So about India's investments, and India's has of course started development cooperation with other developing countries, whether it's in terms of infrastructure, mostly in terms of infrastructure projects, to some extent services as well. Trying to improve capacity building in other countries, and this is happening to some extent. I wouldn't say on a mega scale, but definitely a lot of steps have been taken in this direction. But as far as how much environment related projects, and I think there are again steps that have been taken. This is more recent though. So first of all, how does India really approach these projects when it comes, to an environmental or climate perspective? To a large extent, I don't think India treats these as purely environmental or climate related projects, right? So that's very important to understand. So India is also looking at how to build capacities of people, how to improve their employment opportunities, how to maybe mainstream developmental requirements of the local communities. So a lot of these issues, from what I have understood, most of these projects, which are done under the umbrella of development cooperation, deal with multiple issues. It's not just about environmental protection or climate mitigation or climate adaptation. It's also about building resilience, socioeconomic resilience, and other kinds of resilience which help the communities cope with different kinds of challenges. Overall, I would say, there is no clear strategy. That is one of the problems with India's development cooperation strategy, as how environment is again policy mainstreamed, right? So how is it? How is it in policy? We don't know as very clearly. If you just go and look at India's investments abroad, you will get data, but there's no clarity over what are the guidelines and principles followed when it comes to, say, environmental sustainability or socio-economic sustainability. But there are enough case studies from which we can understand that this is kind of the formula that India has been using. So I think, as with many other cases, we need like a clear cut strategy to say how do we contribute to, say, environmental and climate protection abroad. So China is, for instance, doing that with its green BRI, although BRI itself is like I don't know how green it is so far. It has invested heavily in coal and other fossil fuel projects, and now because of immense amount of pressure from developed countries, they have stated that okay, they won't invest in fossil fuel projects anymore, and they're trying to say they're going to invest more in renewables, and they launched this green BRI and all of that. So maybe India needs a clear-cut strategy. In one, for sure, in two initiatives that India has so far launched: ISA and CDRI, the International Solar Alliance, and the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. In both these cases, I think there is ample opportunity for India to show that leadership once again in showing how development can be carried out in other countries. And now that India has also launched the One Sun, One Grid, One World, at the recent Glasgow summit. Of course, it's a huge challenge. It's this is just the beginning. It's just been launched, and we don't know how the blueprint is going to be in terms of how it's going to be implemented, because this is a massive project. OSOWG. This is not something small. Just imagine just connecting the grids in South Asia itself is like a huge, mammoth political challenge. So I'm not sure how it's going to be implemented. The blueprint is still awaited. In fact, even our net zero target, we are still awaiting the blueprint as to how this is going to be achieved. And there's going to be a lot of discussions around these topics. But through these initiatives, there is ample opportunity for India to show, like even you look at ISA, International Solar Alliance, it doesn't say just like energy security, or it talks not just about climate protection as such. It talks about it's also like training solar mamas, for instance, right? So I mean, this has been happening before ISA was launched, but now ISA has kind of taken upon all these roles and merged all these different programs that have been operating. So they are they're training women in solar energy related projects, or just manufacturing panels and all these things. So this is like, sometimes it's about gender norms, sometimes it's about developmental requirements. Just the fact that there is no electricity in many of the villages which are still not connected to the grid. So you need like decentralized energy systems that can provide electricity to the remotest villages. So these are some of the things that India has been focusing on. The other one, as I mentioned, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, is fairly new as well. But I think this is also going to pave the way for building, maybe like it can be like linked with other infrastructure initiatives like the Asia Africa corridor or other various other initiatives that have been announced in this broader Indo-Pacific region, and how environmental and climate related variables can be integrated into how we carry out projects abroad. So we need a clear cut strategy and guidelines and blueprint, but we have enough experience of dealing with these issues if we look at some of the case studies that may be available. Yeah.
I actually want to quickly jump in and flip it slightly from the investment perspective to the opportunities that India can actually leverage. So here I see it as two areas. One is with the ASEAN and one is with the Quad. So under the ASEAN, I would say that India can actually leverage its position on, like Dr. Jairam has said, on promoting more energy transition. Obviously, this works with working alongside the ISA for supporting distributed renewable energy programs, and for especially in your rural areas for productive use appliances, something that these are very remote areas, don't have grid connectivity, and B, renewable energy can actually provide the kind of like income generation that is required in these particular regions. Two is also looking into the grid integration with ASEAN. So the ASEAN also has a plan of action for themselves on energy cooperation, which is supposed to be from 2016 to 2025. Which is envisioning this entire building this grid across the ASEAN region for power. So the ISA can actually be promoting this whole one grid, one sun, one world policy in collaboration with the ASEAN power grid and action plan as well for energy cooperation. The second area that I also see that we really need to start focusing a bit more on is clean energy and clean air actually. So India obviously has its national clean air program. So does the ASEAN. They have a agreement on transboundary haze pollution. They also have one on sustainable use of peatland and haze mitigation. So this is where both the ASEAN and India, for that matter, have a stretch when it comes to enforcement capacity and inconsistent citizenship support. So this is another area where I think India can work with the ASEAN. The third area is on building a circular economy and on e-waste management. So ASEAN and India both actually have very low per capita waste footprints as compared to the developing world. And Singapore actually does have it's actually been operating many waste to energy plants since like the 1980s. And India's also sort of started their own approved 5 projects on municipal waste management. Thailand has their own 3R program as well. So this is an opportunity when it comes to building on the circular economy. There are also analyses that have been done to showcase that India's critical minerals can be secured from about 44% of it actually can be secured just from actual e-waste management. This can also bring in a lot of jobs in India and in the ASEAN. And the fourth area is looking into how do we pool in resources and investment for insurance of nature-based solutions. Now, again, your Indo-Pacific region and your ASEANs are all coastal regions. These are the regions that we really need to build resilience on. But obviously, investment is not flowing in over here. So how do we, and one of the main reasons investment is not flowing in because the cost of capital in these regions is very high, because there's this entire perception that risk in developing nations to invest is very high. Whether that is political risk, whether that is this whole perception of risk actually. So how do we pull in projects? How do we reduce this perception of risk so that investment can flow better and it can be used for solutions such as nature-based solutions? The second area that India can focus or should leverage is the Quad. So the Quad has obviously already established their clean energy hydrogen partnership. And this is an area where India actually can provide a lot when it comes to, as a developed country, leading itself as a developed country, but also in the Indo-Pacific region. India offers a vast market for green hydrogen with almost an investment opportunity of 200 billion. It also has the renewable energy capacity and resources to create this new ecosystem. This will also the Quad Clean Energy Hydrogen Partnership is also I can see it as like a mini step to creating like this global green hydrogen alliance that is required. across countries, across sectors, to sort of develop this critical technology, which is basically right now being viewed as the solution and fuel for the future. So I think that there is a lot of opportunity for India, but we need the political will. We need the political signal first to come in, and then we need to convert that political signal into technology and technical collaboration and into business investments by crowding in by public finance and also bringing in a lot of private finance.
Um, I'll just add a few points to what my fellow panelists have said. I think both of them have provided kind of a very unique and different perspective in terms of cooperation, and so covered a lot of ground. I think there's only 2 points I want to make. One is actually building on something that Dhanashree has mentioned a few times, which is this area of transboundary cooperation. And I think in terms of magnitude, this kind of India, Bangladesh, the GBM basin essentially is actually where 600 million people of the world reside. And so I think cooperating on the environmental security of the GBM is critical to basically even stability in several countries. And I think on in the GBM, for example, I know that India and Bangladesh have signed several MOUs, but I think there's a need to, apart from renewable energy, I think there's a need to look at inland navigation. And so I think our kind of transport regime and inland navigation, providing a kind of low carbon option, is something that really requires transboundary cooperation. The other area is cooperation in the area of fisheries. And I think there's a lot of scope for, looking at not just your kind of marine and coral health, as well as the risk posed to fisheries, but also look at, for example, India and Bangladesh recently collaborated on Hilsa, which is the Hilsa, the actual Hilsa, which is actually almost 2% of Bangladesh's GDP, and also a really important fish species in India. So looking at kind of those avenues of cooperation. And then the final point to add to something that's already been said is, if India really wants to do things a little bit differently as it becomes a kind of leading player in the environment space, in the renewable energy space, it is looking at externalities very carefully. And this, I'm speaking from experience. A lot of these kind of projects do have externalities, not just environmental, but also on local communities. And I think India has a lot of experience of, how mining projects play out, how renewable energy projects play out. And so when it invests and provides assistance, for example, to different island nations who also have their own indigenous populations and vulnerable environments, I think a policy and a strong policy, a need for the development of such a policy in India to address these kind of environmental externalities when they're looking at cooperation and assistance is going to be critical. Thanks.
I hope I'm audible this time.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. If Abhivardhan has nothing to add, then I have one final question that I need to ask all the three of you, starting with Ms. Jha, if she agrees. My question would be that when we talk about avenues of cooperation for India's international development initiatives in the global south, and specifically in the area of environmental sustainability, I would like you to give us your perspective of sustainability and economic value of all these kind of these initiatives that India is a part of.
Yeah, so I think the building on, for example, what I said, and just to give a concrete example is, for example, we just mentioned that India is making investments across these different countries, across island nations. An example is India's actually the biggest investor, or I think I mean, close with China in of investments in the Maldives, and they're investing in like a $500 million project, one of Maldives' largest infrastructure projects. And so I mentioned, for example, the need to take into account environmental externalities. So it'll be really important if India is playing this kind of leadership role for them to look at strong environmental safeguards, and that will also cement its leadership as a more responsible investor. So yeah, I think that's kind of more concrete thing that I would add to conclude.
Ms. Dhanush, anything to add? Now
Yeah.
you it.
So just to sort of conclude on how India can promote cooperation further in this region and extended neighborhood and beyond, like in the whole Indo-Pacific region, I think one of the things we need to focus on is to build greater cooperation with of course, strengthening the regional organizations in the region, first of all, in South Asia, which are kind of faltering at all levels right now. We have SARC, which hasn't been functioning well since 2014. We haven't had an annual summit except the COVID-19 virtual summit, I mean, virtual meeting, not even a summit that we had. Then, BIMSTEC, which is also not functioning to the expectations that it, was seen as a sort of an alternative to SARC. Other regional organizations, sub-regional organizations such as like BBIN, like Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Nepal. These are organizations which I think we need to strengthen further. We need to use these organizations to promote transboundary cooperation on climate and environmental related issues further. We usually on water, we usually like to have a bilateral kind of engagement with our neighboring countries. That's the usual approach that we have adopted so far. But I think as we see the impacts of climate change worsening, we will need a more bilateral, trilateral, multilateral approach. We can't just have a bilateral approach because the whole basin is being affected by climate change. It's not just India and Bangladesh or India and Nepal. These are all shared rivers after all. So I think that would be one of the first steps. And also we need to build our relations with the regional organizations such as ASEAN, as Nandini mentioned, also with Pacific Forum, for instance. Instead of building new organizations and we have Quad with working groups and everything, I think even Quad, for instance, needs to feed into the existing organizational work that is going on instead of trying to replace them and come up with newer initiatives. I don't think that's going to work because that will end up competing with each other. And, we are going, it's like how it's happening right now in Indian Ocean region. How there are so many organizations looking at pretty much the same issues and you don't know what's happening in the end, right? So there's a lot of overlapping, competing interests and it doesn't really add up to much in the end. So it's important that these organizations function in tandem with each other, and also whatever newer initiatives come have to build on the existing ones rather than create new regional frameworks, which is just going to add to the confusion. I think one of the issues which I probably missed out, livelihoods is one of the most important issues in this region, right? So environmental disruptions, climate change, biodiversity disruptions, all these different disruptions are going to affect livelihoods the most in this region. So we need to have a solid plan for how are we going to deal with livelihood losses, which are going to mount even further as we talk about major disasters, extreme weather events, droughts, or other disruptions, as I mentioned. So livelihoods need to be like at the center of most of our discussions around these topics because we have large amount of population, who are, just above the poverty line, just or many who are below the poverty line, who are going to be affected massively with these kind of changes that are happening. On climate security, I feel India first needs to have its own understanding of what climate security means for India. We don't have a solid understanding of it so far. The security implications of climate change, anyway, like India doesn't recognize it at the international level when it's discussed at the UN Security Council for different reasons. And I think there are very valid reasons as to why India doesn't want to acknowledge these implications of this in the Security Council, which itself is like an unrepresentative organization with 5 veto powers and all of that. So it may not really make sense. But at the national level, we still need an understanding of how climate change is going to affect our security, whether it's traditional or non-traditional, various kinds of. I mean, I don't see much of a difference between traditional and non-traditional today. Why? Because I think they all intermingle with each other. I think it's very difficult to say something is traditional and something is non-traditional today, and especially coming from security studies myself, it's I find it more and more superfluous as I work on it more even further when you look at it from a practical perspective. So it's very important that we understand how our security is affected, how, say, whatever happens in our neighboring countries affects us, or whatever happens in other countries affects us, even if it has some climate element attached to it. So, it doesn't have to be just violence and conflict. It can be anything related to human security as well. So that's very important at a very practical level to have a good understanding of this. And in that respect, one of the things which we will have to have a concrete policy on is like fishing conflicts. There are plenty of fishing conflicts happening in Bay of Bengal region. It's happening now in Arabian Sea also, for that matter, with more and more also Chinese fishing trawlers entering the region. More and more, there's in Bangladesh, for instance, there's been conflict between the government. There've been protests by the fishermen when they're not allowed to go into the seas and fish. I mean, this is their livelihood. As I mentioned, livelihood is very important here. If you don't allow them to go into the waters because the fish, the fish stock is depleting so fast because of overfishing, illegal fishing, that is happening not just because of the countries within the region, but also because external players are slowly entering the fray as well. And climate change is also affecting the biodiversity. That you have fish which is migrating, because of climate vulnerabilities. All these things are leading to conflicts. There have been conflicts already, and there are chances that these conflicts will erupt more and more often as we move forward with all these challenges. So it's very important that we also have, this is just one example of climate security, which I think we need to focus on. There are plenty of other examples, but fishing conflicts is something that doesn't get as much attention as it should. Ideally, I feel, from a very security perspective, and not just from a livelihoods, or which is all linked to, as I mentioned, security. We have, like in the beginning, both Nandini and Aditi mentioned, India generally has a very traditional view of security that needs to kind of shift to take these issues also on board.
I think both Aditi and Dr. Jairam had put some really valuable points ahead. I actually wanted to, I think majorly this question I've already answered in my previous question when it comes to leveraging opportunities with ASEAN and with the Quad. But I think Dr. Jairam has put across this really, really critical point of how every time there is a new issue, there is a new institution that is being set up, or a new organization, new initiative, convention, all of those things. And I think this is, at least in the maritime domain, in ocean governance, this is one of the most critical issues of like this regime complex of like several different types of institutions, conventions, agreements, all sort of overlapping with one on top of the other when it comes to dealing with a particular issue, and not having any idea on who actually governs a particular area or a particular issue. Apart from the fact that your entire high seas and your international waters are completely left ungoverned, we have no idea what is happening over there. We don't know the kind of destruction that is taking place. We don't know who's doing the destruction. We don't know how to solve for the destruction. So one is solving for this regime complex in ocean governance and figuring out what is it that we can do better. So there is obviously this policy that is going into place of building a areas beyond national jurisdiction convention, on where there will be some amount of governance, but this is again in talks that has been going on for several years. We'll only know more about this when it actually gets released. The second area that I actually want to say, this actually might contradict my first point on building more, or not building more institutions, but it's actually on promoting better transboundary cooperation. So the Indian Ocean, despite the amount of trade that we have, despite the littoral of developing countries that we have over here, actually has some of the fewest amounts or fewest number of regional marine conventions and agreements. And this is where I think India can actually leverage the South Asian cooperation to actually build on the South Asian Regional Seas Action Plan to actually build a more legally binding convention. I think it's important that it's about time that we take the action plan that we currently have and convert that into a slightly more legally binding agreement or a convention, actually, using countries like Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and India to leverage this, at least for the Bay of Bengal region. This is where your issues of fisheries can also be addressed. Currently, across the 5 countries, there are only 2 global conventions that they are part of, which is UNCLOS and MARPOL. So on the pollution side as well, we can actually do far greater to prevent the amount of marine pollution that is taking place in these regions if we actually build in some amount of not just voluntary action, but some amount of legality also into what kind of protection we need to take. The third area that I think is very critical is actually redefining the way marine protected areas are defined at the moment. So in the UK, for example, although they do have a large proportion of their coastal areas under marine protected zones, they are also distributed under several different types of zones, classifications. And despite that, about 95% of their marine protected zones still have trawlers for fishing. So unless we're able to, and this is a marine protected area, how can you actually allow such activity as well, such destructive activity? So unless at a global level we're able to redefine this, I don't think there is a solution to it.
Aberdeen, if you have anything to add to.
So, I will conclude this panel by saying that as I was an intervener, I will still be an intervener. And I wished that the panelists get their fair share and space to discuss about policy of environment. So, I think some really important points were discussed about CBDR, the international projects like ISA and others. And I think uh, there's a lot to learn from. I certainly think that uh, in environment law, we really need a much different and nuanced approach to regulation. But regulation alone does not help if uh, the economics and, of course, the entrepreneurial aspects are not engaged at a domestic level. And once the regulatory and the judicial part of it is very, I would say, flexible and reasonable, which we can even find in the way ADR works, I think India can internationalize its environmental role. Let's say what we should say, a climate actor or an environment actor in the Indo-Pacific, much wisely. As I had said in the beginning, the Indo-Pacific is like any other geopolitical construct. Just like a theater of geopolitics, an environment definitely plays a role in it. So, with this satisfaction, and I'd say uh, scintillating happiness, I would conclude this session. I thank all the panelists for their presence, and the cooperation has been amazing. I really wish that we have more discussions on environment in the Indo-Pacific, and not just about India, but also about other countries, as they are also interesting stakeholders. So we end the session, and again, Namova to all, and we look forward to host you again in maybe future Glacons or maybe in our future sessions. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.